Number 9, number 9, number 9.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the ZimmGeek channel. This is my 9th video, and it's a very important one, as I'm answering a question that somebody asked me the other day. Aren't comic books kiddie trash? What a great question. Here we go. Comic books, comics, or sequential art in general are really a combination of words and pictures. And ever since the early cave drawings or the Egyptian hieroglyphics, they have always used pictures in order to tell a story. Once we figured out how to actually write a language, we started slowly but surely putting that combination together. In fact, a lot of newspapers figured out very early on that if they had a picture in their paper, that they actually sold more copies. Now, this was long before photography was available, so they had to rely upon artists in order to draw a picture, in order to drive a point home. But adding pictures, they found, broke up the blocks of text and encouraged people to read it more. So very quickly they found out from their illustrations that if you do a straight illustration of, say, a politician, you'll sell some papers. But if you draw an illustration of that same politician as a pig, you sold more papers because people thought it was funny and they were entertained. It didn't take long for editorial cartoons to pop up in the papers, and one of the very first brands from those editorial cartoons was a little dopey kid, Asian kid, named the Yellow Kid, and he really became the first regular comic character. Soon these newspapers figured out that if you throw another panel next to the editorial cartoon, you're actually telling kind of a story. And very shortly after that, the adventure strip and the gag strip started up in the newspapers, and they sold a lot of newspapers. Also around this time, technology was really rolling along. So the ability to print went from a single press where they were doing one sheet of paper at a time to where they were printing entire huge rolls of newsprint on incredibly large presses rolling off. Those huge presses cost a lot. And the ink in those presses, especially the black ink, used to dry really quick. So in order to keep their presses wet, in order to be able to print the morning edition, wait a few hours, and then print the evening edition, these presses needed something to run on them in order to keep the ink wet. And in order to clean those presses, if the ink ever got dried, was a tremendous expense and ate up a lot of time. And they had a schedule to keep because they were selling so many papers so fast, though at the time they were only selling newspapers for a dime. So they decided to take one of the biggest favorite features in the paper and compress them all together into a book. And that's how a funny book got born. When they took all of the strips, from months back or so, and stuck them all together into a book, and stuck them out on the stand just to see if they could sell them for a dime. Well, these funny books or comic books were incredibly successful. So they started looking for original material, but they really didn't want to pay anybody because they were only selling these books for a dime. So a lot of stuff that was original material in the early comic books were rejected comic strips that they pasted together. And that's literally where Superman came from. Siegel and Schuster took Superman around all of the syndicates, couldn't sell it. They had a guy go, well, I got a funny book I got to find original material for. We'll take your crazy, fantastic idea and cut it into comic pages, and then we'll run it, and we'll see how it sells. And that was Action Comics #1. So right from the beginning, comics were always looked at as the bottom barrel of the illustration market. If you didn't get an editorial cartoon, you tried to do a strip. If you got a strip, then you were rich. But if you couldn't do that and you still wanted to draw, you ended up drawing funny books. And the pay scale and the treatment reflected that. Siegel and Schuster, I'm sure everybody knows, were really gypped out of the rights for Superman for only $130 because the guy told him, we'll just throw them in a funny book and see if they can sell. Of course, nobody wanted to tell these people that they were moving millions and millions and millions of copies at the time of every issue of comic that come out. So it didn't take long before a lot of publishers started doing a lot of different comics really quick with a lot of different subject matter. So this cheap format, just tossed together, used with rejected comic strips or guys that couldn't get real jobs doing comic strips, were always looked down upon. You know, the comics always ended up being treated as second class, and didn't take long before it really got pinned as kiddie literature. The thing is, though, if you go back and you really look at this stuff, a lot of it is just aimed at general audiences more than kiddie stuff. It's kind of like seeing a PG movie and automatically thinking that it was a kid's film. Yeah, we still get that attitude with animation even today. Now, by the time World War II happened, we were already fighting in the comics against the Nazis because Hitler was such a cartoony editorial character. It was very easy to go up against them, and also because there were a lot of people in New York that were working in the comic market who were Jewish, who had friends and relatives that were still over in Europe that were really being plagued by the Nazis. So they decided to give it to Hitler, even though it was just in the funny books. Once the United States got involved in the Second World War, our infantry had a lot of downtime sitting in the foxholes looking for anything to do, so comics really became the key way of relief for these guys. That and whatever movie magazine or newspaper that they could have shipped over. So in order to be patriotic, a lot of these superheroes just started taking up the cause and fighting Nazis and Axis, and really the comics became very propagandized. After the war, all the guys that were over there fighting came home and wanted to restart their lives. They really didn't have a whole lot of time for comics, but comics still wanted to sell to something, so they ended up aiming more towards a kid audience. Things got very, very lighthearted, or some of these guys that came back from the war were actually working in comics before they left, and they decided that maybe it was time for comics to grow up, and they started doing more mature material, like horror stories, science fiction stories, and then eventually crime stories. And you were at a point here where the moms were thinking that comics were for kids, and all of a sudden they were getting these grown-up, more mature stories. So it didn't take long, with a little bit of help from a few psychologists who wanted to get their name in the paper, before comics got a really bad name as far as influencing juvenile delinquency. And that's when the idea that comics were kiddie trash really started to pick up. But the thing that really kicked it off was the fact that you had Senate hearings with these psychologists coming up and talking about how comics were aiding to juvenile delinquency, and the guys were coming up who were in comics saying, no, we're actually doing these comic books for a more mature audience. Congress just could not wrap their head around it. So with the fear that they might actually get censored, some of these comic book publishers decided to step up and create what they called the Comic Code Authority, which was a whole list of rules that literally dumbed down comics. And just about anything with a mature theme was completely knocked out. Now, from what I understand, a lot of these mature-themed comics were selling a lot better than a lot of these other guys. So there was a little bit of jealousy mixed in there. But they were the ones, the Comic Code Authority were the ones that controlled the spiral rack. Some people got through without the Code Authority stamp, but those were the ones that were intentionally kid stuff. But the older, more mature books were completely obliterated. There was no use of the word crime or horror on the cover of a comic. There was no werewolves, no vampires. Everything was really, really constrained. And then after that, we had a good decade of the worst, most kiddie-aimed comics that you have ever seen. For the most part, comics quality really didn't start picking up again until the Silver Age kicked in. At the start of the Silver Age in the early 60s, two very important things happened. Julius Schwartz brought science fiction elements into the superhero genre and rebirthed Flash, Green Lantern, and restarted the Justice League. While over at Marvel, Stan Lee decided to make their characters a little more human and added soap opera elements into their storylines. Unfortunately, you still had the stigma of the Comic Code Authority hanging over their head, plus the previous stigma of comics lead to juvenile delinquency. So both of these companies were really fighting an uphill battle in order to stretch the art form of comics out. And they were pretty successful in bumping into the college and the pop art era. Though the more grown up these stories and characters were becoming, the more they were butting their heads against the wall with the Comic Code Authority. So with Marvel and DC selling like hotcakes, their primary sellers were all superheroes, and the majority of that catered to, quite frankly, male power fantasies, which skewed their demographics into a mostly male readership. And that further gave way to that stigma of that male nerd geek guy sitting in their parents' basement, still reading comics in their 30s and 40s. While sequential art as an art form at this point was growing up, they were finding ways of getting around that silly Comic Code Authority and coming out in magazines and starting an entire underground comics movement that really rebelled against all of the rules that the Comic Code Authority had. This eventually gave way to the direct market in the comic retailer and saw the drugstore spinner rack or comic rack quickly disappear. This is where the comic mainstream really stagnates and the alternative comics spring up. You see a whole black and white era of great imaginative comics come out. You see the graphic novel evolve, and eventually them bumping into bookstores in order to get further coverage away from the comic retailer. Through all this time, with the evolution of comics and sequential art as an art form, that stigma that comics are kiddie literature and kiddie trash still persists in a small percentage, even today. I would say it really started turning within the last 10 years once the Marvel superhero characters really started coming out and being taken seriously as being able to generate money. Still, though, there's a small percentage of people out there that feel that comics are still kiddie trash. It's really a closed-minded attitude or concept if you sit and think about it. And I also feel, in my opinion, that there's a lot of people up there working in these mainstream companies that have that exact same mindset. So they decide to use comics as a means of pushing political agendas or soapboxing instead of telling entertaining, money-generating stories. So really, to answer the question posed in this video, are comic books kiddie trash? The answer is, it all depends on how close-minded you want to be about it and how you want to look at the art form. There have been some tremendous artistic advancements over the years to the art form, but there has also been some horribly degenerative stagnation, roadblocks, and manipulations. That's, to me, part of what makes comics history so very interesting. I would definitely say that sequential art is not kiddie trash, but I will admit that there's a lot of kiddie trash in comic form out there. There seems to be more going on all the time. And if you think that's bad, you need to take a look at animation, especially Cartoon Network. Comics are art. And as being an art form, they are what you want to perceive it to be and what you want to pull out of it. If you want to be closed-minded and have an opinion that was germinated back during the 50s, I guess that's your privilege. And if you want to see it as a great form of entertainment and one of many different ways of communication, well, quite frankly, in my opinion, that's exactly what they are. We're going to get more into comics history as an art form and entertainment media and all of the little bits and pieces as we go along and I do more videos. I have a list of different topics that I really want to discuss. So if you enjoyed this all too brief bit of comics history in this video, please like the video. Please subscribe to my channel because we've got a lot more to talk about. Hit that bell for notifications. I do new videos whenever I possibly can. Every even video, I love to do cartoon instructionals. So look for the odd ones if you want comics history. Look for the even ones if you want to learn how to cartoon, because I can teach you. Then you can do your own comics and your own sequential art, and you can make your own kiddie trash if that's what you want to do. So until next time, take care. Thanks a lot for your tolerance. Hope you stayed till the end of the video. Thanks a lot for being here.